Good evening, everybody. I'm Steve Coll. I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University, and I'd like to formally welcome you to the 82nd Mariah Moore's Cabot Prizes, honoring outstanding reporting from and about the Americas. In a normal year, we'd be together in Low Library across the way from where I am tonight, and we'd be enjoying cocktails and reunions and a lot of warmth and celebration. And I am sorry we're not together that way, but obviously it's not a normal year in so many different ways. And yet I'm thankful that we're together for the purpose that normally brings us to Low this time of year, which is to celebrate great journalism and brave journalists who inspire us year after year through these prizes. Tonight, we're going to hear from and celebrate our latest 4 winners of the 2020 Mariah Moore's Cabot medalists. All 4 are remarkable, courageous journalists who work on different platforms from different places, but have dedicated their lives to reporting on important parts of our hemisphere and our world: Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Haiti, and elsewhere, as we'll hear. Let me welcome and congratulate tonight's winners. From Colombia, Ricardo Calderón Villegas. From Brazil, Patrícia Campos Mello. And from the United States, Ferry. And based in Mexico, but from the US, Carrie Kahn. Ricardo is an investigative reporter, as is Patrícia. Stephen is a remarkable photojournalist, and Carrie is a veteran radio reporter. So all of contemporary multimedia journalism is represented in these 4 winners. Congratulations to each of you. I'd also like to recognize some important people who are here with us tonight virtually. First, welcome to members of the Cabot family. Their leadership and continued support enables us to pay tribute to the best reporting about the Americas year after year. And I'd also like to welcome past Cabot medalists and members of the Cabot board, scholars and journalists who devote their time and expertise each year to choosing our winners. We appreciate the time and the care that you put in to make these awards such a symbol and representation of excellence in our field. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the journalism school students who are here with us tonight, especially our international students, and this year's 4 Cabot scholars who come from Mexico, El Salvador, Sweden, and Bangladesh. Now we'd like to show you a short video about the Cabot Prizes, and then I'll be back to move us along.
I am truly honored to be receiving the Mariah Moore's Cabot Prize tonight.
I'm so moved and so emotional.
For me, this is more difficult than to be in a war zone.
I'd like to thank my editors, the good and the bad ones.
Muchas gracias y muchas gracias a todos.
I'm very happy to be involved with the Mariah Moore's Cabot Prize to recognize excellent journalism work that helps with the understanding among the Americas, especially the United States and Latin America.
It's not a prize for one single project. It's a prize that celebrates a whole career.
Columbia University administers the prize and has done so since the very beginning in 1938.
This is the oldest international journalism prize in the world. It started because my grandfather, John Moore's Cabot, saw these extraordinary journalists and saw the bravery and the talent of these folks and wanted a way of recognizing their extraordinary talents.
It is important to note that this prize is not for courageous journalists. This prize is for excellent journalists. But there is a correlation, unfortunately, in Latin America between being excellent in investigative journalism and the fact that you have courage to put yourself in harm's way.
And so to do independent journalism and extraordinary good journalism and really tell the whole story and what's happening takes a lot of courage. Some of the journalists have been harassed, others have been attacked.
They have faced exile, assassination.
Javier Valdez won a Cabot in 2011 and was then assassinated in 2017.
This prize has never been so important in its history because it sends a signal to the governments who are against press freedom that there is an international eye that is sympathetic to journalists who are doing their job. And not only those press freedom threats are coming from Latin America, but is also very present here.
We want to recognize that the risks they take and the things that they are writing about, broadcasting about, photographing have impact and do contribute to the greater good of understanding our Americas.
Fear is contagious as much as courage.
We must keep fighting back to hold the powerful accountable.
To the journalists that lost their lives for it, and to the journalists that lived their lives for it, salute.
A reminder that we have live Spanish and Portuguese translation available. If you look at the bottom right of your Zoom screen and click on the globe, you can access our interpreters. I just want us to say that on behalf of my colleagues at the Journalism School, there are a couple of reasons why we are so proud to be a part of this institution, the Mariah Moores Cabot Prizes, year after year. The first reason is the one we've already started to celebrate, which is it's an opportunity to shine a light on and recognize some of the most remarkable journalists in our hemisphere, and to lift up their careers, maybe offer them a little bit of protection by recognizing their work when their governments are unhappy about them. And that's a really important part of why prizes matter. There's something else too that seems even more important than usual this year, which is that the work that prizes lifts up is a kind of model of excellence and inspiration for all journalists, especially younger journalists who are trying to discover their own ambitions through work that inspires them, that they can read, journalists that they can listen to. And so there's a kind of leadership in prizes at their best, where the jurors think carefully about what kind of journalism, what kind of storytelling, what media they want to call attention to as a kind of updated portfolio of excellence. And boy, do we need that kind of leadership in the world we're in today. I can't remember in my career a time when misinformation and authoritarianism, populism, from Brazil to Washington, D.C., and many unfortunate points in between have so challenged our profession. We need to change, because the legacy profession that my generation created had so many limitations and so many flaws. And that's one of the reasons why we're under pressure. We haven't changed fast enough, opened our profession wide enough, and continue to think about where excellence is going to come from for the next generation of reporters. But events like this and the journalists that we celebrate and the work that we will all read and think about after we hear from them is a very important way to respond to those challenges. So I'm very proud to be a part of this. And now I'd like to move on to the program. We have, I think, a very meaty program, rich program tonight. We'll celebrate the prize winners, of course, and hear from them. And then we'll also have a very lively panel discussion led by my colleague, Elena Cabral, at the Academic Affairs Department here at Columbia Journalism School. Now I'd like to welcome June Carolyn Ehrlich. She is the chair of the Cabot jury. and the steward of the great decision-making it conducts year after year. She's the editor-in-chief of Revista magazine, the Harvard Review of Latin America at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies.
Thank you, Dean Coll. Welcome to the 2020 Mariah Moores Cabot Awards ceremony. Long before this terrible, devastating time, long before we knew this was going to be a virtual ceremony, I was fretting about what I was going to wear. You see, 40 years ago this week, a Guatemalan journalist, Irma Flaquer, was dragged off the streets of Guatemala for the crime of telling the truth. Her column was called "What Others Don't Dare Say." She liked to wear these clothes because they recognized among the horror and the tragedy, there was beauty and pride and dignity. Today's journalists, today's winners, also recognize that among this horror, there is dignity and pride and beauty. And they try to tell, they tell with their stories through print, through photography, through radio. They tell the truth and convey to us the importance of Latin America and of Latin Americas and the Caribbean. They are the inspiration for our future, for the journalists who are the future, who are studying today, who are beginning today, who will also dare to tell the truth, to put community above self-interest, and to put truth above profit. Congratulations to you tonight, Patrícia, Ricardo, Stephen, and Carrie. You truly are an inspiration. And now it is my great pleasure and privilege to present to you the president of Columbia University, an esteemed member of the law faculty who comes from a journalist family and understands the First Amendment and journalist rights above anyone else that I know. Join me in welcoming Lee C. Bollinger.
We are here to celebrate the achievements of journalists working in the Americas. I'd like to begin by recognizing the Cabot family who endowed this award, which is the oldest prize, international prize in journalism. I'd also like to thank the Cabot board members who work so hard to choose the winners each year. And of course, I want to recognize Steve Coll, the Dean of Columbia's Journalism School. Tonight, we honor the contributions of 4 remarkable individuals: Ricardo Calderón Villegas, Patrícia Campos Mello, Stephen Ferry, and Carrie Kahn. For decades, they have been covering critical events in the Americas, shining a light on stories that are too often underreported or overlooked. With these awards, we celebrate them for the quality of their work, which they produce day in and day out under circumstances that are frequently difficult and even dangerous. It's a reality that's all too familiar for journalists reporting in countries around the world who are increasingly coming under fire for doing their jobs. They're coming under fire from their governments, from non-state actors, and even from fellow citizens. Their reporting is censored, their lives are threatened, and their livelihoods ridiculed. But they carry on. They carry on because they know that the work they do is important and that a free society cannot function without a free press. So tonight, we honor all of them alongside our 4 distinguished prize winners. At a time when there is a persistent undermining of respect for truth and facts, We thank you for doing what you do with such skill, tenacity, and care. It is now my great pleasure to present tonight's awards. Our first medalist's career embodies the values of these awards. Over the course of his long career, Ricardo Calderón Villegas has become one of Colombia's leading investigative reporters. His extensive reporting has kicked off corruption scandals that rock the country, leading dozens of unethical politicians to be removed from office, arrested, and prosecuted. For his courageous work, Calderón has been repeatedly harassed and has received serious death threats. In stark contrast to the use that many journalists make of social media today, Calderón has continued to keep a low profile with his work, preferring to publish his investigations anonymously.
Ricardo Calderón, he has done some of the most courageous and most important and most indispensable journalism in Colombia, I would say. He has dared to cover stories that nobody else has dared to cover. Stories about military intelligence and abuse of power in the military. And when he has a really amazing story, you know what he says? He just says, I think that story is simpática. So it's like, oh, that's a nice story. And then when he says simpático, it means he has a bomb in his hands. He was shot because of that. In 2013, he was fortunately so quick that he jumped off his car and hid in a ditch, and he was able to dodge the attempt. And he, many times, he's been under threat, his family, his colleagues in Samana, and he continues. He just continues.
Ricardo Calderón Villegas, for your courage and for your remarkable body of work, the trustees of Columbia University are honored to present you with the Mariah Moores Cabot Gold Medal.
Good evening.
Buenas noches.
Receiving the Mariah Moores Cabot Award is an immense honor and the greatest recognition for the work done by dozens of anonymous journalists. Above and beyond my own personal satisfaction, for me, the priceless meaning of this prize is recognizing and exalting the work of those of us who believe in long-form reporting that requires thoughtful attention to a great many facts, records, and statements. Because investigative journalism is nothing more than the profound work that we do to fulfill the very essence of journalism, to seek the truth and tell it. A type of journalism that troubles, that annoys, and makes uncomfortable those who seek from the shadows to manipulate, hide, and deform the truth, always for the sake of some interest other than the public's interests. We live in a time when people, especially young people, have been led to believe that truth is something that can be contained in 140 characters, and many media outlets, sometimes paying a fatal price, have lost our way, deceived by the blinding goal of seeking a bigger audience, leading us through the dangerous path of becoming mere news factories. The only ones who benefit from this are the corrupt and powerful of all stripes. They know that this arrangement leaves little time to uncover what they seek to hide, and that's precisely why we must insist on preserving investigative journalism and to find ways to seduce more and more of our colleagues and attract them to the field of investigative journalism. Some argue that this is the most thankless kind of journalism. I believe that it is the one that people most appreciate, the one that most serves their cause. Asking uncomfortable questions, going where no one wants to go, denouncing political or economic or institutional power means that a community can be well informed and better understand how to make decisions. The truth does not belong to us. We try to be bearers of the truth and to share this, to give it to people. The best tool against impunity, fear, and uncertainty is good information, that is to say, good journalism. An investigation is the soul of good journalism. For this reason, once again, I'm so grateful for the high recognition for the prize of this kind of journalism that others would wish to see sink into the murky waters of social networks. At times, the waves are so high that we are unable to see what really happens. Yet we are still afloat. Our ship is not sunk. The collapse or sinking of investigative journalism would not mean the failure of just our part of the profession, but would mean a failure for us all.
Throughout her award-winning career, investigative reporter Patrícia Campos Mello has produced consistently outstanding work. She has had a major impact in Brazil, where the example she has set for other journalists inspires admiration and respect. She has reported from the front lines of war zones and covered disease outbreaks, including Ebola and COVID-19. In 2018, after publishing a series about an alleged financial scheme to elect Jair Bolsonaro, president of Brazil, she was targeted by a campaign of online harassment. She was also attacked by Bolsonaro, his family, and his supporters, and yet she continued to report.
Patrícia Campos Mello, who had been investigating the use of social media and disinformation campaigns by the president of Brazil and his supporters since the electoral campaign. She has been submitted to a tremendous harassment by the president and by thousands of followers of the president in the most horrific ways that you can imagine. She has been in the aftermath of 9/11 in New York City. She has been in Africa covering Ebola, and now, as we speak, she has been in hospitals in Brazil covering the intensive care sections of hospitals taking care of COVID-19 patients. So it's a whole body of work, but that connects with sometimes with this kind of hardship.
At a moment when independent journalism is under attack in Brazil and other countries throughout the Americas, the trustees of Columbia University are honored to present Patrícia Campos Mello with the Mariah Moores Cabot Gold Medal.
Good evening, everyone. Our countries, Brazil and the United States, are facing unprecedented challenges. A pandemic that has caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, a deepening economic recession that has left millions unemployed, and the rise of populist leaders with authoritarian impulses. In both countries, the attacks against the press have rarely been so vicious. A new form of censorship, outsourced to troll factories and amplified by bots on social media, is an integral part of the so-called illiberal democracies. Journalists are frequent targets of intimidation and persecution by the government, with the help of social media and digital militias, lawsuits, and character assassination. The situation is especially critical for female journalists. Much more frequently than our male colleagues, we have our parents and our children intimidated, our appearance mocked, our addresses and phone numbers exposed, and we are subject to violent threats, both online and in the real world. Since I started investigating disinformation operations in Brazil, thousands of memes, videos, and messages have circulated on the internet in which my face appears in pornographic montages, calling me a prostitute and alluding to sexual organs. I have been a journalist for over 25 years, and I covered conflicts all over the world, in Libya and Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. I never needed a bodyguard. Yet, when I was covering the elections in 2018 in my hometown of São Paulo, I needed a bodyguard. I have been covering US-Brazil relations and elections in both countries since 2005, and I have never seen such an assault on the checks and balances that safeguard our democracies. In this moment, the work of professional journalists, whose mission is to investigate, report on the ground, and check information, is vital. I would like to thank Steve Coll, Dean of the Columbia University Journalism School, and the selection committee of the Mariah Moores Cabot Award. I dedicate this award to numerous colleagues in Brazil who have been targeted. This award helps us show that journalists will not be intimidated. We will continue investigating and doing journalism. Thank you. Obrigada a todos.
Our next Cabot medalist, photographer Stephen Ferry, has dedicated more than 3 decades of his life to projects that have become models of immersive photojournalism. He moved to Colombia in 2000 to cover the country's armed internal conflict. Ferry's impressive body of photography reveals an almost poetic eye for the tensions inherent in the daily lives of people forced to live at the edge of human endurance, where violence and conflict seem always about to erupt. As a teacher with the Foundation for a New Ibero-American Journalism, his meticulous work has inspired generations of Latin American photojournalists.
Stephen Ferry is an extraordinary photojournalist and chronicler of the human condition. And I use the word photojournalist, but he's really, if I can dare say so, a poet of violence who can show you the most horrific scenes and uncover the most horrific scenes. But he does so with a dignity for the people who suffered. And so his photographs create this mixture of emotion of anger and fury and sadness and a sense that because these photographs exist, justice may be done. He gives us the story without the words through some of the most searing images, but also some of the images that give you a sense of who these people are and what a loss it is not to have them.
Stephen Ferry, for a career of excellence and for furthering inter-American understanding, the trustees of Columbia University are honored to present you with the Mariah Moores Cabot Gold Medal.
I am so happy to receive the 2020 Maria Moores Cabot Award and very happy for my fellow prize winners as well. After a number of years covering Latin America, I first went to Colombia in 1995, invited by the Gabriel García Márquez Fundación para un Nuevo Periodismo, now called the Fundación Gabo, and this experience changed my life. It was there that I began to realize the severity and the extent of Colombia's war, which I then went on to document for almost 2 decades. And I also began to learn the vital importance that journalists support each other, that we teach each other, that we create community. This spirit of mutual support is so important in Colombia because of the high level of risk associated with the work. The Consejo de Redacción, another very active professional organization, was born of the initiative by journalists to investigate the killing of the director of La Patria newspaper in 2002. And likewise, we created the International Press Association of Colombia after the kidnapping of a French colleague by FARC guerrillas. The Fundación Libertad de Prensa is very experienced in defending colleagues under death threat and denouncing threats to press freedom. I am very grateful personally to the FLIP for the way they responded to the revelation that units of Colombian military intelligence had been spying on Colombian civil society, but also on Colombian journalists and foreign journalists throughout 2019. Fellow prize winner Ricardo Calderón, who's an amazing investigative journalist, and myself were targets of this campaign. I want to be clear that for foreign journalists, the risk is not nearly as great as it is for our Colombian colleagues like Ricardo. But state actors are often responsible for these threats. Indeed, this spying campaign may have been carried out with equipment provided by the United States to Colombia for counter-narcotics purposes, which has been announced in the US Congress. So when important institutions like the Maria Moores Cabot Prize are looking at the press in Latin America, the prize awards excellence, to be sure, in the work, but it also can help to shine light on threats against press freedom in Latin America. Thank you very much.
Our final award this evening goes to Carrie Kahn. Kahn has been bringing stories from Mexico and the Caribbean to life on the radio for nearly 3 decades. She began capturing voices of the border region as a local reporter in San Diego in 1994. Moving to NPR, she was the first journalist from the public radio network to reach Haiti after the devastating earthquake in 2010. As NPR's international correspondent based in Mexico for the past 8 years, Kahn has produced deeply informative narrations of narcotics violence, political turmoil, and surging migration. Through the immediacy of audio, Kahn's reporting reveals Latin America to millions of American listeners.
Carrie Kahn is a magnificent radio reporter who has used her base at National Public Radio to humanize and make accessible stories from Haiti, from Mexico, that brought the voices and the sounds in a way that one could understand that tragedy.
Teresa Figueroa steadies her balance with a hand on the shoulder of her friend, Rosa Maria Velasquez. She climbs into white hazmat coveralls and zips up. The two women, both in their early 60s, are preparing to enter a crime scene.
Busco Manelik Ayala Velázquez, desaparecido el 27 de septiembre. Es mi hijo.
Velasquez has been searching for her son, Manelik, since he went missing 3 years ago.
She looks at issues like drug trafficking, not from the macro perspective, which is also very important, but from the individual. She captures the voices, she captures the stories, and she gets them out there to the general public.
Carrie Kahn, for an outstanding career and for furthering inter-American understanding. The trustees of Columbia University are honored to present you with the Mariah Moores Cabot Gold Medal.
Hi, saludos desde la Ciudad de Mexico. I can honestly say this is the highest honor I have received. When I got the call from the Cabot board, I choked up and was speechless. When I regained composure, all I could think to say was, is this what it feels like to get that early morning call from Oslo? For me it was, and it is. I'm very humbled and grateful to the Cabot board and Columbia University for this honor. I'd like to thank my family, my dear, dear husband, Ramon Beristain, who has been unwavering in his sport, making great sacrifices to his own career to ensure my success. Thank you. To my beautiful, strong daughters, Isabella and Mimi, who make me so proud and push me to be a better person. To NPR, which has long supported my professional endeavors and instilled in me the mission of public service journalism. Thanks to my longtime editors, Phil Bruce, Dee Dee Skanke, and most recently Martha Wexler, your guidance, work ethic, and journalistic values are unrivaled and invaluable to me. Mostly I want to acknowledge and thank my great colleagues. In my more than 2 decades as a journalist, I've worked with some of the best on both sides of the border. I've learned early on how to work in Latin America and journalism from many incredible journalists. I watched how they could get answers, how to push the powerful carefully, and figure out ways to publish amidst some of the most terrifying threats and dangers my colleagues in the U.S. can't even imagine. We know all the statistics, the horrifying numbers of journalists killed in Latin America. Mexico, where I work, many say is the deadliest in the world for journalists working outside a war zone. 5 have just been killed this year. I learned early in my career how journalists in the South face these threats and challenges. I was a cub reporter in Tijuana challenging a U.S. official on his law and order stance. Instead of answering my question, he berated me and he told me to sit down, and I did so quickly. Each Mexican reporter he picked after berated him right back and demanded an answer to my questions. I've never forgotten that camaraderie, something I wish we'd see more of at some White House and State Department briefings. I've tried to emulate that fellowship throughout the years. I've watched colleagues step out of prisons and jump back into the fray, and I've tried to match that bravery. And I've tried to hold on to that fight to see justice served, despite the demoralizing impunity that persistently survives. I've had the luck and honor of working with some of the most inspiring defenders of our trade and democracy. And I know with all my heart that I wouldn't be here accepting this distinguished honor from all of you without all of them. Thank you very much.
Congratulations to all of the 2020 Mariah Moores Cabot Prize winners. Now I'd like to introduce the moderator of tonight's conversation with the Cabot medalist, Elena Cabral. She is an adjunct professor and director of the part-time program for Master of Science students at Columbia Journalism School. She also runs the school's international programs in Europe and Latin America.
Thank you, President Bollinger. I'm honored to be with you tonight. As Steve mentioned, every year we look forward to this event that honors these extraordinary journalists in a grand and beautiful space under the dome of Low Library with lots of fanfare and grandeur. It involves a gorgeous dinner and dessert and lots of treats. But the truth is, for our students especially, the real allure of this event is to listen to the stories of journalists like the 4 honorees gathered virtually with us tonight, to hear their voices and learn about their very personal motivations for doing this work that unites so many of us, particularly at moments like this. So I appreciate the opportunity to moderate this conversation. Our guests have made this job easy for me by submitting some wonderful questions, which I will first ask of the group, then of individual honorees. Then I will be taking questions in the chat later in the session. As a reminder for those just joining us, there is a globe at the bottom of your screen where you can click on the interpretation of your choosing, English, Spanish, or Portuguese. In doing so, you can mute the original audio if needed. So let's begin. You know, I said these questions are very interesting, and they cover a lot of the usual questions we hear from our students. Why do you continue to do journalism? Hold power to account, knowing the high price you pay. What's the hardest part of journalism? What's been the effect of Donald Trump on press freedom in your home country? Well, the one that I found interesting and most interesting, because as storytellers, these individual anecdotes can say so much more than, you know, a broad answer. So I'd like to ask one that was submitted that asks of you, what was the most life-changing story that you have covered and why? Can we begin with Ricardo?
Okay.
Good evening. Thank you.
Buenas noches.
Thank you for this
inmenso
recognition. I think there's one account that
personalmente
personally and the journalists at La Semana shaped us. This had to do with an espionage case of the Security Department. This is sort of a CIA and FBI agency that over many years and at a difficult time of Colombia's internal politics, began to harass judges on the Supreme Court that were investigating important political officials because of their links to drug trafficking. This also led to attacks and threats against many journalists to silence them. And it had years of working and was rather archaic in its methods. And in Colombia, it was considered one of the most dangerous institutions because of its links to paramilitary groups and drug traffickers, and had been even linked to some very well-known assassinations. We worked for a 2-year period on an investigation and were constantly being harassed and threatened, but we continued to publish our stories. And the closer we got to those who were behind the commands and the orders given for these threats and these harassments, all of our sources seem to lead us to certain members of the presidential office, of the president's office. We published, over the course of those 2 years, 150 articles on this story, suffered a great deal of pressure of all kinds. And while we were revealing and uncovering much of this story, finally, there were significant attacks, both politically against the newspaper and personally against the members of the reporting staff. And this also affected the owners of the magazine as well as their colleagues. The investigation finally concluded in a series of members of the president's, in the capture of members of the president's staff of the Casa de Marin. And this had an effect as well because it resulted in the arrest of high-level officials, 25 mid-level arrests, and after 60 years of existence, this agency, the security agency, was closed. And this had a great benefit for Colombian society because of the extensive history of violating human rights by this agency and because of its dark links and connections over the course of decades. And this led to a series of important reforms and the creation of a new intelligence organ that it was expected would not repeat these same shadowy practices that for decades had marked its predecessor. The length and the duration of the investigation, I think, is one of the most memorable experiences that I lived through.
Sí, claro. Muchas gracias. Patricia, la misma pregunta para usted.
Thank you. I'm not going to speak Spanish because my Portuñol is not very good. So I could either speak Portuguese or English. So I'm going to go with English. No, it's okay. I think the story that had the most impact on me was in 2015, we had the Zika outbreak in Brazil. And many women who were pregnant, the babies were being born with microcephaly, it is a very difficult disease for the babies are severely disabled. And it's very hard to take care of these babies if you don't have decent health care. And me and a colleague, photojournalist Avenida Prado, we had just come back from Sierra Leone in Africa, where we were covering the Ebola outbreak. And of course, Sierra Leone had been through so many years of civil war, so it was a very difficult situation. We were really it was a big impact, the situation of the hospitals and everything. So a year later, we go to Brazil, there's a Zika outbreak, and we go to one of the states in the Northeast, Pernambuco, and we go to a hospital, and they don't have a pediatrician. And so you had all these women that were having babies that really needed special care. And one of the mothers that we met there, Daniele, this is the one I always remember her. She used to be a teacher, like a kindergarten teacher, and her husband was like a cab driver in motorcycles. We call them mototaxi. So they were very poor, and they were in the city, and they didn't have a pediatrician, so they had to travel every week 6 hours to the capital. And they were still so happy, and they loved the baby so much. And they were like, he used to sing for the baby. And I'm thinking, okay, so this is Brazil. There's no pediatrician for this place that is supposed to be the hospital that is gonna treat all these people here around. There's so many babies which need special care. And then you meet this mother who's still really, hopeful and happy and so in love with her baby. So I think that's the story I remember.
Yes, that's quite good. Thank you very much. Stephen, can we hear from you about your experience behind the lens?
Hi, thank you. Recently, with my sister Elizabeth Ferry, who's an anthropologist, we carried out a long work about small-scale gold miners in Colombia, called La Batea, which stands for the mining pan that miners use. And it was very instructive for me because I realized that I had a whole set of stereotypes in my own head that were stereotypes that circulate widely about the gold miner. At that time, gold mining was becoming more and more a source of financing for armed groups in Colombia. And that was kind of a sexy story. And it was a story that was worth doing. But at the same time, that sexy story covered up a world of situations in which small-scale gold miners and their communities were struggling to defend themselves against both multinational corporations who wanted to get at their gold and also from armed groups. Many of these communities practice gold mining in a sustainable way. Many of them go back, Afro-Colombian communities that go back to the time of slavery, indigenous communities. And so I realized how easy it is, if you're not careful, to fall into a kind of shorthand, especially when violence is involved, that overlooks the real experience of people and presents a much more nuanced view of what's taking place. So that was a very important growth moment for me.
Absolutely, I can see why. Carrie?
That's a hard question, just a lot of different stories. I think most impactful probably would be covering the Haiti earthquake. It was a very, very difficult time. I've never seen such death and destruction before or since in one place. And talking to victims and sort of transmitting that and seeing the outpouring of Americans because of our reporting was very impactful. I stayed for 2 years in the region and continued to cover because the mismanagement by US charities of the money and the billions that Americans gave was particularly distressing too. So it was impactful too, and important to stay there and stay with the story and follow the money, not to quote a deep source there, but so that was pretty important. And I think more recently now, dealing with the victims of tragedies that's going on in Mexico with the high rate of impunity and the degradation of the rule of law here. We could call it the drug war or whatever you want to call it, but it's difficult. And the mothers and the fathers and the brothers and sisters and talking to them, you feel like you're helping a little bit just by letting somebody let it all out and discover it. So those are important stories. And also it was kind of cool climbing into Chapo Guzman's escape tunnel. So.
Oh, did you do that?
So that was kind of fun too.
That sounds like a memorable moment. Thank you very much. Now, if I could ask you a few questions individually. Ricardo, your investigative work has exposed corruption in the Colombian military and the government. And, there's a lot of curiosity about how you develop your sources. But I think you made very clear in your speech that you have a disdain for social media. But do you see a role in it in terms of bringing the stories of the Americas to the broader world and in fostering understanding, a greater understanding of what is happening in these countries?
Yes. This work, the work with the military, and I think the same thing happens in other Latin American countries, covering the issue of the military is complex. It's a very closed story in many ways, and it's dangerous also to find sources. These are efforts that take a long course of time. It takes weeks or months to develop sources and to begin to build trust, to get enough information to confirm and to pull the strings that are necessary until you get what you're looking for. And to work with military sources, this has taken years. And we've eventually been able to publish those reports. One of the most complex issues in our work in Colombia has been to protect our sources. And we know it's never worth sacrificing the life of any one of our sources or the safety. Sometimes we would have to wait for months to be able to publish, to be able to protect a source. the reports that were published in La Semana, and I referred to this somewhat in my initial remarks, gives us the advantage of doing what I call long-form journalism, or journalism that takes a long time to develop. And this is the work that we did in covering the stories of the military and paramilitary.
Stephen, your photographs are these intimate looks at sometimes tragic and violent situations. How have you been able to get this access to your photographs, to militias, rebel groups in times of conflict? What strategy do you use?
As Ricardo said, there's a lot of patience, there's a lot of time involved. And there's, as he said as well, there's a lot of concern about not burning people along the way. As I mentioned when I spoke, for myself as a foreign journalist in Colombia, the risks are probably a lot less than for Colombians. But if one is not careful, you know, somebody who takes you across the river in a boat, or who takes you someplace in a cab, or who introduces you to a paramilitary commander, can suffer the consequences, can get killed if something goes wrong.
Yes.
So there's a lot of concern about that. It takes time. What I learned, and my Colombian colleagues were very clear at the beginning, was that it's important to be really forthright and just say, you know, to a commander, I'm not here to do you any favors. Don't expect from me that I'm going to tell your story in beautiful terms necessarily. I'm asking your permission, because you control the area, to be here and to be able to talk with people and to be able to take pictures. That's all I can promise. And that seems better than raising false expectations.
I have a very quick follow-up question for you that I don't want to skip, because it's a very specific question regarding what is Ojo Rojo Fábrica Visual? Where is it based and how does it work?
Thank you so much for asking that. Ojo Rojo is an initiative that 6 photographers, 5 photographers and a curator are involved in. It's a community space that looks to promote documentary photography in the context. We started in 2016 as the peace process was going on, and recognizing the complexities of covering Colombia, the dangers. We're there to create a space where people, safe space to dialogue around issues using photography, and to promote best practices in documentary photography to kind of advance the cause. So come visit anybody once the pandemic is over soon. We should be open in Bogota.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Patrícia, you were honored by SPJ last fall with an International Press Freedom Award. And while here in the US, you had an audience with Vice President Mike Pence to express concern about press freedom violations. Can you tell us about that experience?
Sure. I was actually with colleagues from India and Pakistan, and it was interesting how the behavior and the rhetoric of the US president, of President Trump, was a huge influence on our leaders. So when I was speaking to Vice President Mike Pence, I told him that the situation in Brazil is a democracy, but the environment for journalists is very hostile at this point. I mean, more than ever. And that journalists were being attacked, not only verbally, but, you know, legislation and lawsuits and also verbally. And he said, does President Bolsonaro, what does President Bolsonaro do about this? Or what does he say about this? And I had to tell him that he actually, you know, stimulates it, endorses it. And he seemed quite surprised. I'm not sure, maybe because, I mean, why would he know anything about Brazil? There's so many countries, but I kind of saw some legitimate concern, or so I hope to see.
Interesting. Okay. Carrie, you talked a little bit about, you know, some of the stories that you've done on the drug wars in Mexico. we're curious about how COVID has affected this long-standing battle and the drug trade itself.
The drug trade continues unabated. There was disruptions in supplies of precursor chemicals from China, but it seems that there has been other ways to make up for those. Their seizures are still at record numbers at the US border, and you can see that the price of cocaine, methamphetamine on US streets hasn't dropped, so it continues unabated. The violence in this country is at record levels despite the pandemic and despite a few months when there was a lockdown. It wasn't an enforced lockdown. There's never been one here. But the violence levels, homicide rates are high, are set to surpass last year's level. So it's a discouraging sign that things are still continuing. I'd say the only thing that is changing a little bit is marijuana production in Mexico has gone down as more marijuana is legalized in states in the United States. But marijuana producers here switched to other crops, and other methamphetamine is unabated in the United States. In certain parts of the West, it's growing, the addiction problems, and that fuels the violence here. And so I would say, to answer your question, not much change at all.
Well, yesterday I asked, and it was a fascinating response that I got that I would like to share with the audience today about the pandemic. And, Carrie, to start with you, you mentioned yesterday that, like in the United States, the government in Mexico has downplayed the virus. What has been the result of that?
It's the president that has downplayed the virus. There are state actors that.
Right. Right.
Mexico has the 4th highest death toll in the world from COVID. That's a stunning statistic, given that Mexico follows the US, Brazil, and India, all with populations far greater than Mexico. There's very little testing done in Mexico. We have a positive testing rate of 41%. That means that nearly half of all tests done in Mexico come back positive. That just shows that Mexico is testing only those who are really sick, those that are already in the hospital with symptoms. So we really don't know the full extent of the health crisis here. On the positive side, Mexico was able to ramp up hospital capacity, and there's not been a collapse of the chronically underfunded public health system here. Unfortunately, most people don't trust the public health system, and they wait until the last minute to go to the hospital. And so that's also a significant factor in the high death rate here. On the economic front, we have a president very much like his Brazilian counterpart who has downplayed it. And from the beginning, President López Obrador here has prioritized the economy over the health crisis. And Mexico is headed for quite an economic crisis. Economists say that, the economy may contract 10% this year. That's the worst since the Depression. And that just means millions of people will fall into poverty and deeper levels of poverty. And the economic gains of the past decades will be lost for millions, and hard hit will be the middle class. The president just balked for the stimulus program and for individuals or businesses. So it's been difficult. But the one thing that's most curious about is that polls show that he has a 60% approval rating among Mexicans. So his popularity is still high.
Really?
People love.
Ricardo, ¿nos puede contar sobre la situación en Colombia?
Colombia, at the current time, is very close to what has happened in other countries, which is that we're facing a second wave, we think. In a few weeks, it has some of the highest levels. I think we're close to 30,000 dead and about 1 million who have been infected with COVID. And that's the reason for the government adopting a gradual reopening, which has been critical for certain economic sectors, but unfortunately, as has been the case in other countries, this has a direct impact, and it may lead to stricter quarantine measures on behalf of the government. I think the government was rather correct in the control and the initial strict measures of quarantine, which allowed for a fairly fragile health system to protect the number of ICU units. There are obviously rural areas in the country where we need to see improvements in this area. And we have to see how the government would respond to a new wave. They have to address the economic challenges as well as public health.
Patrícia, it's interesting, Bolsonaro and Donald Trump have in common that they both were infected with the virus. What impact did that have on in Brazil?
The fact that he was infected?
Right, and the way that he handled that and presented himself.
Yes, I mean, the fact that he was infected didn't change anything at all in his behavior. It sort of validated his whole approach to see, okay, so this is just a regular cold. And we had, since the beginning, a very schizophrenic thing, because you had state governors telling people, you know, you have to stay home, social distancing, this is important. Whereas the president was saying, okay, so this is, he didn't say it's a hoax, but he said, well, maximum like 1,000 people are going to die. This is really not serious, and the economy is the important, just like Carrie and Ricardo said, just like the other countries and the US. And then we ended up having the second highest death toll in the world. And the people in the poor communities were really affected as well, because you have online classes and many people don't have decent internet connections, and you don't have jobs because the economy. So these are some of the things that it was actually, I think maybe I have a hope that it's good that it's the value of journalists, professional journalists, because it's journalists that were going to poor communities to say, you know, how these people are dealing with this, people who don't have jobs anymore, and go to public hospitals to say, so how's the situation inside the public hospitals? How are they dealing? Do they have enough medication and everything? And also, there's a very extraordinary thing that happened because the government tried to change the way the statistics was being done about the disease. They were trying to implement some changes that would end up omitting part of the casualties, the deaths. So all the main media outlets got together and they formed a consortium that got their information directly from state governments, because we could no longer trust government from the data from the federal government. So these are some of the ways that like all the journalists try to, I mean, it's very hard to report because you have a government actively trying to downplay everything and, you know, not show the figures. But I think that the situation is still very difficult here.
Yes, that's fascinating, the way that that information is being obtained locally. A question from Maria Teresa Ronderos for you all. How important has collaboration been for you to have a supporting team, colleagues in media and elsewhere for your work? And do you think journalists are getting less and less of this kind of support with the digital disruption, as it's called? Actually, Ricardo, I'd like to ask you that. I'd like to put that question to you because I was asking you earlier about the idea of the social media having a role in pushing this news beyond boundaries of one single country. Can you answer this question about collaboration and of support for the work of news organizations like your own?
Obviously, the dynamics that all media are facing requires more collaborative work with digital platforms. There's no doubt that this will allow reaching larger audiences. Historically, I think at times that lone wolf model that was the researcher journalist has changed a little, precisely because of a search for larger audiences. But the great challenge here is to be able to reach a larger audience without this being in detriment of information that is reliable, quality information. In other words, to take the time and to collaborate in newsrooms to do in-depth coverage cannot be at the expense of producing information massively. And obviously, some media tend to do this, but collaboration between media in search of better in-depth research and better articles is going to be essential. The challenge is how to prevent the digital eruption from torpedoing long-term investigative and reporting journalism.
Gracias. I think there's another question here. How has the winners of reporting been affected by relations between their countries and neighboring countries and the North-South relations in the hemisphere? Carrie, I think you could answer that.
It is now hailing very, very hard here. I don't know if you can still hear me. I could barely hear you all. I don't know if I understand the question exactly.
How your reporting has been affected by relations between neighboring countries and the North-South relations in the hemisphere.
I think the presidency of Donald Trump has affected all of us and all of our reporting. I think that's the biggest effect here in this. A lot of what we hear in press conferences in the U.S. are now mimicked in press conferences. The president here has an hour and a half, 2-hour morning press conference every single weekday morning from 7 a.m. till 9. Much of it, he berates the press. He picks on particular outlets. He picks on particular reporters. Foreign reporters are not excluded from that. I think that behavior and the fake news, we hear fake news all the time. It's made it very difficult. Also, it has strained relations with other countries in the region. The Trump administration, with its single-mindedness dealing with Mexico and Central America only in terms of migration, has strained relations between countries in the region. We just had another surge of migration come through the region, people like to call them the caravans, a group of hundreds of migrants left Honduras and came into Guatemala since the borders are now reopened, and troops came to pick them up at Guatemala border. There was accusations between different ambassadors. The single-mindedness, I think, that this region, and the only way it deals with the United States is with regard to migration now, has been a troubling change. Before, Mexico had a much broader arrangement with the U.S. government. They were able to compartmentalize. You could talk about trade, you could talk about migration, you could talk about other issues separately. Now everything all is dependent on migration. So it's been difficult, and it has strained the relationship.
Yes, indeed. I think you're right. I'd like someone is asking about media metrics. Here in the U.S., we're seeing more and more niche media companies, subscription-based media companies, and newsletters proliferating. How do you think this is going to affect journalism, especially in America? Patrícia?
That's a tough question. So let me see if I understood how the fact that media outlets are having newsletters. No.
Well, there's sort of this proliferation of subscription-based media companies, the niche media companies, and then this sort of newsletter trend. I would think it's the sort of thing that Ricardo, and others are worried about in the way that it has an effect on deep dive journalism, investigative journalism, getting stories out from the region. Do you see it having an impact?
Well, it depends. If you have online outlets that are niche outlets, but they are doing, in-depth investigative reporting. If you have newsletter, they are simply compiling other people's news, or just putting in a newsletter other reporters or journalists work, then it does not help. But other than that, I think it's part of the reality now that you're gonna have, trying to reach very specific audiences with very specific newsletters. I don't think it's necessarily bad to, investigative journalists. It depends.
Our colleague Janina Sinini asks a great question about what U.S. journalists can learn, and Patrícia, you could probably answer this as well, and Carrie too. What U.S. journalists can learn from the experience of American and Latin American colleagues who are used to deal with populist political leaders for decades.
It's interesting when we first started hearing that President Trump was speaking on specific journalists, and I remember that former President Chavez did this all the time. Like he spent, and he said specific journalists, and he said that on live TV. I'm not saying that makes it less horrible for American journalists, but it is a tradition. It's like you first target specific media outlets, and then you ultimately personalize the attacks. You have very personal targets. You expose these people, and this it's very difficult. We're not used to being the news or to being in the news, right? That's not how it's supposed to be. We just want to be behind, just writing or reporting. So I'm really sorry for my U.S. colleagues that you have to go through what we have been going through, and itself it sort of perpetuates itself. But now, because President Trump does that now, then our populist leaders do it even more. So not very optimistic in that sense.
Yeah, I'm wondering who has ownership of the word fake news. Where did that originate? One never knows. Carrie, that was such a compelling anecdote you shared. I think a lot of women journalists too can relate to someone barking at them to sit down, and the initial reaction is to sit. But things have changed for you and for other women covering these kinds of administrations. What do you think that change is, and what advice would you give?
Don't sit down.
Don't sit down.
Don't sit down. It's tough. It is. There's a lot of women in journalism now. It's just amazing. I watch my female colleagues, and I'm in awe of them. I just, do your best and keep going. It just, you're not alone. And to answer all the other questions, I think having colleagues in the region is I couldn't do it without the colleagues that I have in Mexico and the camaraderie that we have. And if I could just say one other thing about the last add-on to what Patrícia was saying, my U.S. Colleagues complained at the beginning of the Trump administration all the time about they're not getting their calls returned, not getting data, not getting information. They couldn't understand what was happening. I was like, welcome to our world. This is where we've been working for many years. And I do feel like it's taken the U.S. press and U.S. journalists a while to actually call what is happening, by what is actually happening. As foreign journalists, we speak out a lot. We use different words. We use regimes. We use lying. We say other terms that, when you hear a president saying he can't commit to a peaceful transfer of power, we talk about coups. We talk about the military, the role of the military. We go straight for all of these things. Yeah, and it's been interesting as a foreign journalist, as a foreign correspondent, to watch the U.S. press deal with the Trump administration, and there was a steep learning curve. And my foreign correspondents in NPR, we would talk about, if we heard the same things, we would report on it much differently. So I think it's been an interesting and a steep learning curve for many of my US colleagues, if I can say that.
Stephen, one of the things that our students grapple with here in the US in covering, really tense moments and violence in our streets is the notion of self-care. When you're a photographer and you're photographing really horrible events, dangerous events, how do you balance that work with the need to, have a life, to be able to have outlets to look to and still make a living?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think it's really important that people let go of some idea that it's glamorous and, adventurous and cinematic to be covering violent situations. Maybe it's natural at a certain age in one's life that there's, the adrenaline rush and all is exciting. But there's real suffering, and there can often be a big psychic cost to oneself. So it's, been a good development. There are, in our profession, there's the DART Center, and there's more consciousness around, the psychological consequences of covering disasters and covering war. And that's been a great development. We're less macho about the whole thing than we used to be. Mm-hmm. And there's also, risk and other kinds of programs that help people stay safe in the field. But I think people need to keep in mind that they have to watch their own kind of internal emotional state.
And you've not been able to return to Colombia at the moment. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
How have you been able to stay in touch and sort of keep up with stories that you've been following?
Yeah, very much. Myself and my crew at Ojo Rojo are doing a journalistic work with the Truth Commission, which is to unearth historic images about an episode in Colombia's history that was a war that occurred. There was bombing with napalm, there was trench warfare and everything. And because of press censorship back in the day, this is in the 1950s, it completely disappeared from consciousness. So we're very anxious to get out in the field and photograph survivors and interview and kind of do the active part, not just the archival part.
Oh, wonderful.
But
That's
yeah.
fascinating. Love to see more about that. Love to see more of that work. So I would just like to close tonight by thanking our honorees for joining us. We very much hope that we will be able to come back next year to help, that you will be able to come back next year to help us in this continuing celebration of this work and of your colleagues in the field. Thank you very much, everyone.